December 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle steamed under a sky heavy with rain. Inside a dim command hut near Rabaul, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Army studied field reports from the embattled island. Maps were pinned to bamboo walls. Red pencil marks traced American positions along the Lunga perimeter. And in the thick, humid air, a belief hardened into doctrine. The Americans, they concluded, lacked discipline. To the Japanese command, the evidence seemed obvious. Patrol reports described American units moving unpredictably through the jungle. Soldiers built crude camps in irregular patterns. Officers tolerated initiative from junior ranks. Marines improvised defenses rather than following a rigid formation. To a military culture built on hierarchy and absolute obedience, this looked less like adaptability and more like chaos. The assumption spread quickly through the officer corps. For decades, the Japanese military had trained its soldiers under the austere philosophy of bushido, a warrior code emphasizing obedience, endurance, and absolute loyalty to command. Individual thought was subordinate to collective will. Orders were followed precisely. Discipline was visible, rigid, unmistakable. American forces appeared to operate differently. Small unit commanders made decisions independently. Scouts deviated from orders if terrain demanded it. Supply officers improvised routes through the swamp and jungle. Even enlisted men were encouraged to think for themselves in combat. To the observers in Tokyo and Rabaul, this seemed dangerously undisciplined. One Japanese intelligence officer summarized the view in a field memorandum in early 1943. The American soldier fights bravely, but without spiritual unity. His reliance on comfort and individual judgment will fail in the jungle. It was a conclusion born not from careful analysis, but from cultural certainty. Japanese commanders believed jungle warfare demanded absolute control, relentless endurance, and a willingness to die without hesitation. And they believed only their army possessed such discipline. What they were about to discover, deep in the Pacific jungles, would challenge that belief in the most brutal way imaginable. August 7, 1942. The first American landing craft scraped against the beaches of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. At dawn, nearly 11,000 men of the United States Marine Corps began the first major American ground offensive of the Pacific War. To commanders of the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy, the invasion was shocking but not yet alarming. Japanese strategic culture had been shaped by decades of triumph. Victories in the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and rapid expansion across Asia after the attack on Pearl Harbor had reinforced a powerful belief. Moral strength determined victory. The Japanese soldier, commanders believed, possessed an almost supernatural resilience. He marched farther, he endured hunger longer, and above all, he obeyed without hesitation. The philosophical foundation of this belief was bushido, the warrior ethic absorbed into modern military doctrine during the early 20th century. In training manuals circulated through the Imperial Army academies, soldiers were reminded constantly that surrender was dishonor, and death was preferable to retreat. The result was an army built around uncompromising discipline. Japanese infantry units were trained to move in precise formations even in difficult terrain. Orders flowed downward through strict chains of command. Initiative outside formal authority was discouraged. The system produced soldiers capable of extraordinary endurance, but it also created an officer corps that equated discipline with visible control. This belief shaped how Japanese leaders interpreted their enemy. Reports arriving from Guadalcanal described American soldiers constructing makeshift defenses, altering patrol routes, and sometimes arguing with officers before executing orders. To Japanese observers, such behavior bordered on insubordination. One staff officer attached to the 17th Army, Imperial Japanese Army, wrote in a dispatch from Rabaul, "The American soldier values comfort and personal judgment. In prolonged hardship, he will weaken." Japanese planners believed the jungle itself would expose these weaknesses. Guadalcanal was not merely a battlefield, it was a hostile ecosystem. dense rainforest, flooded rivers, malaria-infested swamps, and suffocating humidity. Supply lines collapsed easily, food rotted, weapons rusted. To Japanese commanders, such an environment demanded rigid discipline and unwavering obedience, and they were certain the Americans did not possess it. Yet hidden within the American ranks was a different kind of strength, one that Japanese doctrine had never truly studied. A military culture that encouraged individual problem-solving. Small units are able to adapt without waiting for orders. And the logistical machine capable of feeding thousands of soldiers deep inside a jungle war. At first glance, it appeared disorganized. But the illusion would not last long. September 12, 1942. The jungle south of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal lay silent beneath a heavy tropical night. At 9:30 p.m., columns of soldiers from the Imperial Japanese Army began moving through the darkness. Nearly 6,000 men of the Kawaguchi detachment advanced through thick rainforest toward the American defensive perimeter. Their commander, Kiyotake Kawaguchi, believed he understood the enemy before him. American Marines, he had been told, were poorly suited for jungle warfare. They were dependent on supply lines, vulnerable to exhaustion, and too individualistic to maintain cohesion during prolonged night combat. Japanese doctrine predicted that once pressure was applied, American lines would collapse into confusion. The attack plan reflected this confidence. Japanese forces would infiltrate the jungle silently, approach the American perimeter undetected, and overwhelm the defenders through disciplined night assaults, an approach that had already succeeded across Asia in the early months of the war. But the battlefield that night did not behave as Japanese planners expected. The Americans waiting along the jungle ridges were soldiers of the 1st Marine Division under the command of Alexander Vandegrift. They had spent weeks adapting to the island. Patrols had mapped the terrain. Outposts had been positioned along likely avenues of approach. Defensive positions were layered with machine guns and artillery coordinates. Most importantly, American small unit leaders were given freedom to react. When the first Japanese units emerged from the jungle near what Marines would later call Bloody Ridge, the battle did not unfold according to rigid doctrine. Individual squads shifted positions. Machine gun crews adjusted their fields of fire without waiting for orders. Artillery observers radioed coordinates directly to batteries behind the lines. To Japanese officers observing the engagement, it appeared chaotic. But it was not chaos. It was controlled improvisation. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry advanced through the darkness, charging uphill into entrenched Marine positions. The discipline of the Japanese soldier was undeniable. Units continued advancing even under devastating fire. Yet the American defense bent without breaking. Throughout the night, Marines repositioned weapons, rotated exhausted units, and improvised defensive lines as pressure shifted across the ridge. By dawn on September 14, the Marine floor below the positions was covered with the bodies of more than 800 Japanese soldiers. The assault had failed. But inside Japanese headquarters, the explanation did not change. Commanders insisted the defeat was temporary. They believed the Americans had simply been lucky. They still believed discipline would decide the war. And they were already preparing the next attack. October 1942. The campaign for Guadalcanal had entered its 3rd brutal month. Inside headquarters at Rabaul, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Army studied casualty reports that grew more alarming with each passing week. Entire battalions sent to dislodge American forces were vanishing in the jungle. Supply columns disappeared. Reinforcements arrived exhausted and malnourished before they ever reached the battlefield. Yet the central assumption remained stubbornly intact. Japanese leadership still believed the Americans would eventually break. In the Japanese view, war was decided by spirit, what they called seishin. Discipline, obedience, and willingness to sacrifice were believed to outweigh material advantages. The American soldier, often caricatured in intelligence briefings as soft and comfort-loving, was expected to lose his will under sustained hardship. But the battlefield was revealing a different reality. American forces on Guadalcanal endured the same suffocating jungle conditions. Malaria spread rapidly. Tropical rain turned foxholes into mud pits. Food was often reduced to canned rations and captured Japanese rice. Yet the American system functioned in a way Japanese planners had not anticipated. Supply ships from the United States Navy continued reaching the island with ammunition, medical supplies, and engineering equipment. Air support from Henderson Field allowed aircraft of the Cactus Air Force to strike Japanese convoys approaching the island. The American war machine, industrial, flexible, relentless, was slowly tightening its grip. Japanese troops, by contrast, faced catastrophic logistical failure. Food deliveries often arrived too late or not at all. Many soldiers survived on jungle roots or small handfuls of rice. Ammunition shortages forced units to conserve firepower during engagements. Entire formations weakened from disease and starvation long before combat began. Still, the attacks continued. In October, a new offensive was ordered under the command of Hirokichi Hayatake, commander of the 17th Army, Imperial Japanese Army. Nearly 20,000 Japanese troops would attempt another massive assault on the American perimeter around Henderson Field. The doctrine was unchanged: night infiltration, close assault, absolute discipline. But the battlefield had already shifted. Allied radar detected an approaching aircraft. Naval patrols intercepted reinforcement convoys. Marine and Army units strengthened defensive lines with artillery and machine gun nests. When the next assault began in late October, Japanese infantry again advanced with extraordinary courage. And again, they were cut down. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The Americans were not disorganized. They were adaptable. And adaptability, combined with industrial supply, was proving more lethal than rigid discipline alone. Yet by the time Japanese commanders began to understand the mistake, it was already too late. January 1943. The jungles of Guadalcanal had become a graveyard. Inside forward command posts of the Imperial Japanese Army, officers now faced reports they had once considered impossible. Entire regiments had been reduced to skeleton units. Soldiers staggered through the jungle with malaria, dysentery, and starvation. Ammunition had run dangerously low. More than 24,000 Japanese troops had been committed to the island. Fewer than half remained combat capable. Meanwhile, American strength was growing. Fresh units from the United States Army had reinforced the exhausted Marines of the 1st Marine Division. Supply convoys reached Henderson Field with increasing regularity. Aircraft dominated the skies. Artillery controlled the jungle approaches. The strategic balance had shifted beyond the recovery. On January 4, 1943, Japan's high command made a decision that months earlier would have been unthinkable. Guadalcanal would be abandoned. The evacuation plan, known as Operation KE, would attempt to extract surviving forces before American offensives could destroy them completely. Throughout late January and early February, fast destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy slipped through the darkness, pulling thousands of emaciated soldiers from the island. By February 9th, the campaign was over. The Japanese army had not lost because its soldiers lacked courage. Few military forces in modern history had demonstrated such relentless determination in combat. But the assumptions of its leadership had proven disastrously wrong. Japanese commanders had mistaken flexibility for weakness. They believed that initiative meant disorder. They believed that comfort bred softness. They believed rigid discipline alone could conquer the jungle. What they had failed to understand was the nature of the war they were fighting. The American system encouraged decentralized decision-making. Junior officers adapted tactics instantly. Engineers built airstrips in weeks. Logistics officers delivered food, medicine, and ammunition across thousands of miles of ocean. It was not chaos, it was organized adaptability, backed by industrial power. The Jungle War exposed a truth that Japanese doctrine had never fully considered. Discipline could sustain an army, but discipline alone could not defeat a flexible enemy supported by an industrial superpower. Guadalcanal marked more than a battlefield defeat. It shattered the belief that spiritual strength alone could overcome modern warfare. From that moment forward, the momentum of the Pacific War began to move in only one direction, and the empire that had once believed itself unstoppable would spend the next 2 years fighting a retreat it could never reverse.